Hello, mic check. ज्योतिरज्योति जल रीति कंदर ज्योति रजते उजल रीति कंदर तुमी तम भंजन हार प्रभु तुमी तम भंजन हार दिदि तिलंग रंग भंग बाजे अंगुठंग मृदंग दिदि तिलंग रंग भंग बाजे अंगुठंग मृदंग गाइছে छंद भक्त बृंद आरती তোমার গাইছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার জয় জয় আরতি তোমার হর হর আরতি তোমার শিব শিব আরতি তোমার ভান্ডার ভাব বান্ধার জাগো বান্ধার বন্দিত মায় জয় শ্রী গুরু মহারাজ কি জয়। ওং রিম ঋতং তম চলো গুণচেত গুণেভ্যঃ নাক্তাং তেবং সকরুণং তব পাদ পদ্মং মোহং কশং বহুকৃতং ন ভজে যতোহং তস্মাত্তমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো ভক্তির্ভগশ্চ ভজনং ভবভেদকারী গচ্ছন্তলং সুবিপুলং গমনায় তাত্ত্বম বক্ত্রধৃতোপি হৃদয়ে ন মে ভাতি কিঞ্চিৎ তস্মাত্তমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো তেজস্তরন্তে তরসা ত্বয়ি তৃপ্ত তৃষ্ণা রাগে কৃতে ঋতপথে ত্বয়ি রাম কৃষ্ণে মর্তামৃতং তব পদং মরণোর্মিনাশং তস্মাত্তমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো কৃত্যং করোতি কলুষং কুহকান্তকারী স্নান্তাং শিবং সুবিমলং তব নাম নাথ ইয়াস্মাদহং ত্বস্মরণো জগদেকগম্য তস্মাত্তমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো ওং স্থাপকায় চ ধর্মস্য সর্বধর্মস্বরূপিণে অবতার বরিষ্ঠায় রামকৃষ্ণায় তে নমঃ। ওং নমো শ্রী ভগবতে রামকৃষ্ণায় নমো নমঃ। ওং নমো শ্রী ভগবতে রামকৃষ্ণায় Ramakrishna Namo Namaha. Sarvamangala Mangale Shive Sarvartho Sadhike Sharane Trambake Gauri Narayani Namostute Srishti Sthiti Vinashana Shakti Bhuti Sanatani Gunasaye Gunamaye Narayani Namostute Sharanagata Dinarta Paritrana Parayane Sarvashyarate Hare Devi Narayani Namostute Jayo Narayani Namostute Jayo Narayani Namostute Jayo Narayani Namostute Jayo Narayani Namostute जय महामाई की जय जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So we have come to a rather crucial paragraph in this lecture, Maya and the Evolution of the Concept of God, by Vivekananda. And here he is pointing out the difficulty and the limitations of all our conceptualizing, of all our even elevated thought. And so let me start from where we left off last time by repeating the first couple of sentences of this paragraph, where he says, what you call matter or spirit or mind or anything else you may like to call them, the fact remains the same. We cannot say that they are. We cannot say that they are not. In other words, any attempt at conceptualizing, dividing our existence up into convenient dockets given by this facility for language that we as a species, we as human beings have, describing one part of our existence as the body, one part of the existence as mind, and a third part as spirit. These are merely convenient words to create dockets and the illusion of clarity, the illusion of understanding in our minds. And when we are pressed, we cannot say they are one, we cannot say they are many. In other words, the mind, when it starts trying to seek above everything else clarity, it is faced with these intrinsic contradictions, these conflicts, these confusions that define our our day-to-day existence. This eternal play of light and darkness, indiscriminate, indistinguishable, inseparable, is always there. A fact, yet at the same time not a fact. Awake and at the same time asleep. This is a statement of fact, and this is what is called Maya. Again, encouraging us, exhorting us to introspect and not take things in our customary cavalier fashion of taking words in terms of their usage as it is, as they are, but rather trying to probe them to the limits and trying to understand what really lies at the foundation of these words and ideas which we have as individuals, in terms of which we interact with the world and create an image in our heads, in our minds. These concepts, these words, what do they really mean? What is the reality behind them? What does being real even mean? And this particular foundational quest is what leads us deeper through enquiry, through questioning. We are born, but we are faced with these contradictions. And then what happens is that these contradictions that we take for granted and do not challenge come up in our consciousness, in our minds, and we are forced to address them, forced to look at them and try to understand what they are in themselves. We are born in this Maya, we live in it, we think in it, we dream in it. We are philosophers in it, we are spiritual men in it. Nay, we are devils in this Maya and we are gods in this Maya. Stretch your ideas as far as you can, make them higher and higher, call them infinite or by any other name you please. Even these ideas are within this Maya. It cannot be otherwise. And the whole of human knowledge is a generalization of this Maya, trying to know it as it appears to be. In other words, our starting point is our sense data. There is no other place to start. Yeah. Anything when we say that we know this in some ad hoc fashion, the starting point is invariably given to us by our sense data. But then the other part of the mind kicks in and starts trying to make meaning out of it. This is a deeper faculty of the mind, something that expresses itself in various ways. One, it tries to thread together various observations and manufacture a story out of it, a narrative. This is our brains in function, at work. It's basically trying to string together a bunch of observations, and in order to give meaning to them, it tries to put a thread through all of them. This thread could be something which can be tested out in practice, in which case we say that it is closer to the truth. Or it just strings together various facts and posits some kind of explanation which is not even an explanation, and then we just call it a story. These become parts of cultures and they are propagated from generation to generation. The animals, for instance, elephants, for instance, or they basically take their children, little elephants, along to various parts where they will get water, get food at some part of the year. This knowledge that is acquired in a particular generation is then passed down. Human beings do very much the same thing, but in somewhat more sophisticated ways. We have a culture, we have garnered a certain measure of knowledge, and that needs to be passed down to the next generation so that the species survives with the skills that are required to handle this day-to-day existence. That takes the form of stories, of mythology, etc., etc. All attempts at trying to bind a society together. But then the question comes, what is true in all this? And then the stories start getting more and more refined. Sometimes it takes the form of greater abstractions, fundamental principles, and this is what comprises philosophy. When it develops an ability to be tested in terms of our experience, in terms of something that is universal, we call it science. something which is verifiable in practice, and it has basically stuck its neck out. It makes a prediction about nature which is not observed, but which you can in principle carry out experiments to verify. This criterion was called by Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science, it was called falsifiability. Unless you make a statement which is falsifiable, that means an experiment which will prove it false. Yeah? Suggest an experiment whose outcome, if it goes one way, it's basically in terms of binaries. If the theory is correct, then there is an experiment which will basically say that, look, here is this bunch of experiments that we have conducted, and here is the output, and this output is in accordance with the predictions of this theory. The greatest example that comes to mind is Einstein's discovery of the general theory of relativity. What it predicted, what was the scientific theory prior to Einstein's general theory of relativity? It was basically that planets moved around the sun in perfect elliptic orbits. Einstein's theory basically said that no, they are not perfectly elliptic. There is a little deviation from that elliptic. There's an oscillation about an ellipse which you can somehow experimentally verify. This is most visible in the planet Mercury because it's closest to the sun. So the sun's gravitational field exerts its influence most on the planet Mercury. There was an experimental observation which said that Mercury does precess, means it oscillates about an elliptic orbit. The general theory of relativity then computed what the precession of Mercury would be, and it did turn out to be in accordance with the observed data, and this led people to believe that the theory of relativity was something that was really going towards some truths, some deeper aspect of human perception and knowledge. There was another prediction which had not been tested at all. There was no experimental data. And this really is the strength of the theory. What it did was predict that light rays coming from stars towards the earth, we are accustomed to believing that they always move in straight lines. In the absence of gravity, this was indeed true. However, Einstein's theory predicted that once when the light ray crosses the sun being a heavy, very massive body, the light ray actually bends in that gravitational field. This prediction came out of the blue. It was not in accordance with current wisdom at the time. So it was something that was startling. And a British astronomer, astrophysicist, they went to the North Pole or maybe the South Pole, one of the poles, during an eclipse to test the veracity of this prediction. And, wonder of wonders, well, perhaps not to be wondered really, they did find that light does bend around the sun. See, the point is, in the presence of the sun's very bright rays, you will not be able to detect rays from distant stars coming around the sun. But during an eclipse, that was possible, and it was tested, and the veracity of that theory was proven basically because it made a prediction that could be checked using observations on this earth. It is vis power, which means what? The theory of relativity predicted something measurable. Somebody went and measured. If the outcome turned out to be false, if it was not in accordance with relativity, then one would have simply said, look, this theory is all very good as far as it goes, but here is where it breaks down. It does not precisely predict the trajectory of the rays of light from distant stars coming around the sun and reaching the earth. It is this kind of a prediction that makes us believe in theories. Essentially, see, how are you going to lead your life? Not on the basis of some story. When we go out onto the street and then try to reach somewhere, we have this belief that the car is going to reach us to some place because it's based on these large, universal, impersonal principles, not dependent on the personality or the likes and dislikes of the individual concerned. As we have said before, this is what in Vedanta is called Purusha Tantra versus Vastu Tantra. Purusha Tantra is what depends on opinion. Vastu Tantra is what depends on the nature of the object from its own point of view. No human point of view, no bias is going to change that. In other words, if you pick a little ball or something, some solid object, and let it fall, it's going to fall down with a certain acceleration, a certain velocity which can be measured, and these numbers are going to be independent of who is doing the observation. This independence of the individual subject is what gives credibility, value of truth to theories. Theories which do not even predict things are not theories, they are just stories. That's the difference. So here we are. What he is asking here is something even more fundamental than these truths, than even truths which we regard as impersonal. These are basically, we start with narratives, with stories, and then start to distill them out so that we get to a narrative which is capable of verification, which is capable of falsifiability, which is essentially then a theory which has either a value true or a value false. But where does that theory lie? Where does that understanding lie? Is it in the outside world? Or is it in the human subject? And that observation and the consequences we draw from them, these have significance only with respect to how we are going to act in our lives. In other words, it has a subjective significance. This notion of truth, this notion of meaningfulness is finally a subjective concept. By subjective, one does not mean that it is something that is subject to whims and fancies. It could be something universal, but it guides the movements, the lives of individuals according to their subjective convictions. And if something is true, finally it has this capacity to move us to act and proceed in our lives according to it. However far these ideas may be, what Vivekananda is saying here is that stretch your ideas as far as you can, make them higher and higher, call them infinite or by any other name you please. Even these ideas are within this Maya. Why? He's basically encouraging us to probe further, probe deeper. What do we really mean when we say such and such a theory is true. For instance, I think all of us here have this conviction that tomorrow the sun is going to rise in the east. And we will regard that as true. Well, probe it a little deeper, scientifically, well, not very far back, maybe less than a couple of thousand years back, which in the history of the universe is not even a drop in the ocean. Less than a couple of, just a few hundred years back, this was less than 1,000 years back, in fact. So, people discovered that the earth was actually round. So, when we say that the sun rises in the east and goes down in the west, immediately the various stories that went before that, attempts of the human mind to explain where the sun comes from, where the sun goes at sunrise and at sunset, these were basically the stories were thrown away, and a universal, a much more objective, true explanation now from the point of view of the sun itself, from the point of view of the earth itself, was found out when people basically removed this anthropocentric view of the world and realized that the earth is just one planet out of several. The sun is just one star out of several. And though it appears very large to us, there are many stars which are much larger. So what happened then? Then this statement, the sun is going to rise tomorrow in the east, took on a different connotation, a deeper connotation which is not given to us by our senses. It basically came as a piece of knowledge that the earth goes around the sun and spins on its own axis. When it starts facing the sun, we call it day. When it faces away from the sun, we call it night. So the sun rises is not something that the sun does. It's a product of something that we as part of the earth do. It's the earth that does the sun rising. It's rotating and rotates to face the sun. So this deeper meaning, this more factual, truer meaning starts dawning. It's not something that's given to us by our senses. It's given to us by our capacity to probe natural phenomena. And this deeper knowledge then becomes shared amongst other members of the species. Fine. And now one is coming to something more fundamental. Well, there is this idea then that the earth rotates about the sun. It's a truth that most of us have an idea about. But then we ask this question, okay, fine, you have interpreted sun is going to rise tomorrow in the east as this statement that the earth is going to rotate and tomorrow morning is going to rotate so that it faces the sun. What really lies at the back of this conviction? Why do we believe in it? And then we are forced to say, look, this is how we have seen it several times, and so we have no reason to believe otherwise. And everything keeps on continuing in its own rhythm. And so the earth is going to continue to spin, and so the sun is going to continue to rise. Do we really have no better explanation than that? Perhaps not. Perhaps we are basically saying that these laws of nature are inviolable. These laws of nature are more permanent. And therefore, tomorrow the sun will rise because the way we understand this world is in terms of these more permanent, but more abstract facts which we call laws. Where is the law? Say the law of gravity. The law of gravity which makes the earth spin around the earth, which makes the earth spin around the sun. Where is this law? Is the law there outside somewhere? The law is in our minds. It's our minds trying to grasp nature. And when we unify a bunch of natural phenomena, then we abstract from it this truth which unifies these various phenomena, and we call it a law. But then this law really becomes something impersonal, something true, something universal in all of us. It's not there outside. It's there in us. It is there as part and parcel of our understanding of this thing that we call the world, the thing that we call nature. But then the probing is no longer outside. The probing then starts becoming into our own hearts and minds and asking of ourselves, what is it in us that makes us declare something to be true, something to be false? And this simple example, this shared belief that the sun is going to rise tomorrow in the east, it makes it clear that it is precisely these impersonal universal truths that guide the foundations of our life. It is not somebody else's opinion which colors our mind for a while, but rather these universal things which do not depend on an individual's opinion that we call true. The question then arises, what is it in us? This is moving one more level backwards towards the foundation of our mind. What is it in us that declares these impersonal things, these universal things to be true? What is the quest for truth? And we come up with finer and finer ideas, and this is what he means when he says you can call them infinite or by any other name you please. So we could call them universal, we could call them infinite, but even then these are ideas. Did we have this idea, for instance, about the sun going to be rising tomorrow when we are deep in sleep? No, there was no idea. So then that idea has gone from our minds. If we are absorbed in a piece of music or in something, does this idea of the sun rising tomorrow abide in our minds at that moment? No. So then what is it in us? What is there in our subjective faculty of understanding that makes us move towards these truths on which we base our whole lives? What is it in us? The enquiry no longer is objective but has been turned towards the foundations of knowledge in ourselves. It's become a subjective enquiry, an enquiry into the subject, more precisely. And so, this whole infrastructure of thought, of understanding that we build up in terms of our emotional reaction to the world, in terms of our epistemological or knowledge or intellectual or even tactile response to the world, this is an exhaustion to probing its foundations. Because these are limited pieces of knowledge. We are giving it names. We are giving it forms. And those are actually objects that don't really lie there outside. The sun outside we never know. It is the image of the sun that our brain and mind concocts. That is what is real. That is closest to the perceiver in us. Say, for example, there's this mic in front of us. What does the word mic mean? It's just a word. If you say mic to somebody who does not know English or somebody who doesn't know that word, this image is not going to come to their minds. This reality of this object in this physical, tangible sense will not come to their minds. So he says, this is the work of Nama Rupa. So our usual way of understanding anything is to encapsulate it in a conceptual framework. Words. This is called Nama. And sometimes we refer to something in terms of our eyes, and so say that, look, there it is. That's what you're seeing. That's what is called Rupa. Name and form. Everything that has form, everything that calls up an idea in your mind is within Maya. For everything that is bound by the laws of time, space, and causation is within Maya. In some sense, it is precisely this framework of time, space, and causation, in terms of which we deal with our whole external reality, that is given this one little word epithet, and it's called Maya. It's basically saying something that is at the base of it, very simple, very obvious, but something that we keep avoiding, keep not addressing squarely. Namely, what? Whenever we speak, the way these words come out, it's a sequence, right? The first is followed by the second word. The second word is followed by the third word. If you take a sentence and muddle its words and put them in some other order, the meaning is not going to be conveyed. So it is in time that the sequence of words makes sense. If you see something in space and basically, let's pick an image, and you can now project it into a computer and just allow the pixels to be muddled all over, then that original picture is not going to emerge. It's not going to make sense. So our way of seeing, our way of hearing is intrinsically bound up with these ideas of space and form. When we see an object in front of us, when we hear something, our brains have been accustomed to making sense of these things in terms of an abstraction called space, which the mind basically says, look, there is this visual field. And this visual field has some arrangements of objects. And what is the matrix, the framework for all of that? That is what is called space. Similarly, if you have a sequence of events, then what is the framework which gives meaning to this sequence? That is what is called time. So we say we measure it by a clock, but that is not time. We say we put coordinates. This is this city, that is north of that city. This is south of that other city. We are putting our mental framework of what is north, what is south, etc., assuming there is something more fundamental called space. And when you have a sequence of events following one another in a way that that sequence never gets disturbed, we call it causation. And all our thought, all our ideas, our entire life in the context of these phenomena are bound by these three fundamental abstractions called space, time, and causation. So if you don't like this word Maya, just replace it. Replace it by, on the one hand, space, time, and causation, the framework that bounds our epistemology, our quest for knowledge. And if you want to think about it in terms of your emotions and feelings, basically it is, and in terms of ethics, it is these contradictions, these conflicts that arise in our hearts. This is an existential fact. No explanation. This is as far as we can go. And then we are asking, what is it that is the foundation of these abstractions? What is the foundation of these contradictions in feeling, in emotions, in ethics? On the one hand, what is the foundation in us of space, time, and causation? Just yesterday I was hearing something, and there's this little question which is posed. What are you doing when there is no problem to solve? Take the word problem in the most general sense. What am I doing when I have nothing to do, nothing to accomplish, no intent? This is a question. This is a question to foster greater introspection. When we are straining to understand, we are trying to understand things in terms of this framework of space, time, and causation. We are trying to resolve conflicts in ethics, in emotions. But suppose there is none of this to do. Where are we then? Where does it arise? Where do these conflicts arise? Where in us do these ideas arise? Where in us does this idea of space, time, and causation arise? This is called inquiry. Yes. It's asking foundational questions about ourselves to ourselves. We'll take this up again next time. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.